My mistress deserves the place you failed to keep. He said it without lowering his voice, without checking the hallway, without a single moment of shame. And Helen heard every word. 7 years, 1 son, 1,000 silent sacrifices, and this is what her marriage had become. Not a failure of love. A deliberate choice he made while she was still standing in his house. If this story made your blood run cold, you are not alone. Subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from, because this one is for every woman who gave everything and was told it still wasn't enough. The wooden box was small enough to carry in both hands, and Helen had carried it from London carefully, the way you carry something fragile that matters. It was rosewood, polished to a warm glow. Inside, wrapped in ivory silk, sat a pocket watch, the kind Richard had admired in a shop window 2 Christmases ago, when they had still been the sort of couple who walked through London together and noticed things. She had remembered. She always remembered. The watchmaker had engraved the back panel herself, standing at the counter, while the old man squinted at her handwriting. 7 years. Still yours. H. She had not told anyone she was coming home early. The dinner in Mayfair had ended before 10 o'clock, Lady Ashworth's sudden headache, the kind that dissolved a gathering in minutes, and Helen had accepted the early close with something close to relief. The carriage ride back to Winthrop Hall took 40 minutes on dry roads, and she had spent most of it looking out at the dark countryside, the box resting on the seat beside her like a small patient companion. She had been thinking about what she would say when she found him. Richard was not a man who responded well to sentimentality. She knew that. 7 years of marriage had taught her exactly which versions of herself he received easily, and which ones made him go quiet and distant, the way a room goes quiet when someone opens the wrong door. So she had been composing something light. Something that wouldn't make him feel cornered by affection. A joke maybe about the engraving. A casual hand extended across the distance that had grown between them, small enough that he could take it without feeling obligated. She was still composing that sentence when she entered the west corridor. Winthrop Hall was never fully silent. Even at this hour, the house breathed the settle of old timber, the whisper of draft through window frames that had never fit quite right, the distant sound of someone in the kitchen banking the fire for the night. Helen knew every sound this house made. She had learned them the way you learn the sounds of something you are responsible for. And that evening, as she moved through the corridor toward the private drawing room where Richard usually took his late brandy, she heard something that did not belong. Laughter. A woman's laughter. Not the polite, measured sound of a dinner guest. Not the contained amusement of a household servant. This was easy laughter. Comfortable laughter. The kind that comes from a woman who believes she is exactly where she is supposed to be. Helen stopped walking. The drawing room door was not fully closed. A gap of 2 inches enough to let light spill in a thin gold line across the corridor floor. Enough to let sound travel clearly through the still air of the house. She did not move toward this door. She did not move away from it. She simply stood. Richard's voice came first. "You never pretend with me." His voice was low and relaxed, the particular tone she had not heard him use in years, the tone of a man who has put down everything heavy and is simply resting. "That's what I've always valued most about you. There's no performance." The woman laughed again, softer this time, more intimate. "Darling." The word landed like a stone in still water. "You say that as though your wife performs at breakfast." A pause. Helen heard the sound of glass being set down on the side table. She knew that sound, knew exactly which table knew the way. The crystal rang against the mahogany edge. "Helen performs everywhere." His voice had shifted, taken on something flatter, more definitive. "She is excellent at it. Managing the house, managing appearances, smiling through dinners she despises. She is very good at being the Duchess of Winthrop." Another pause. "But she is not good at being my wife." Helen's hand tightened around the wooden box. "Richard, no." He cut the woman off gently, not harshly, the way you stop someone from saying something unnecessary. "I've thought about this carefully. Clara, you understand the man I truly am, not the title, not the obligations. You see what's actually there." A beat of silence, and then the words that arrived like something physical. "My mistress deserves the place you failed to keep." The corridor was very cold. Helen had not noticed it before, but she noticed it now, the chill of the stone floor through her thin-soled evening shoes. The draft from the window at the far end. The particular quality of stillness that comes after something irreversible has been said. She looked down at the rosewood box in her hands. 7 years. Still yours. H. She stood in that corridor for a long time. Long enough that the fire behind the drawing-room door crackled and settled. Long enough that the woman inside Clara, he had called her Clara, and Helen recognized the name now with a clarity that felt like cold water, said something else, something too low to hear, and Richard responded with a sound that was almost a laugh. Then Helen turned around. She walked back the way she had come. Through the west corridor, through the entrance hall, down the front steps, to where the carriage driver was still waiting, because she had told him to wait, in case she needed anything from the village before morning. He stood up when he saw her coming. "Your Grace." Concern in his voice, she must have looked something she was not aware of looking. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine, Thomas." Her voice was steady. She was surprised by how steady it was. "I've forgotten something at my parents' home. Please take me to Langford House." He did not argue. He was a good man who had worked for the Winthrop household for 11 years and understood that questions were not always appropriate. She climbed into the carriage. She placed the rosewood box on the seat beside her again in the same position it had occupied on the ride out, like a small patient companion who had waited through something terrible and was still there. The carriage moved. Helen did not look back at Winthrop Hall. She had been 25 when she married Richard Winthrop, not young by the standards of her circle. Most of her friends had been married 2 or 3 years by then, had already produced an heir, and were well into the comfortable, settled life of a country house and seasonal London visits. But Helen had not been in any particular hurry. Her father had not pushed. Her mother, Margaret Langford, had made it quietly clear that she expected Helen to choose with her head fully engaged, because a woman of their position would have to live inside her choice for a very long time. Richard had been 31, already the Duke of Winthrop, already in possession of the kind of presence that made rooms reorganize themselves around him, not because he demanded it, but because he carried authority, the way some people carry height as simply a fact of how they move through the world. Their first real conversation had happened at a dinner party in Yorkshire, and Helen had spent most of it arguing with him. He had been holding forth about the management of tenant farms, something that in her assessment he understood from the perspective of a man who had read reports about it, rather than one who had actually walked the land and spoken to the people working it. She had said so, not rudely, but directly. The table had gone quiet, and Richard Winthrop had looked at her with something that was not quite amusement and not quite surprise and said, "You've been to the farms yourself, then?" "Every season since I was 14, Helen had answered. "My father believed his children should understand what sustains us." He had been quiet for a moment. Then, "And what did you learn?" It was the right question. She had not expected it from him, and the fact that he asked it genuinely, without condescension, leaning forward slightly, as though her answer actually mattered, had shifted something in her assessment of him. They had talked for 2 hours after dinner in the Ashworths' library, while the rest of the party played cards in the adjoining room. They had talked about land management, and then about books, and then about a piece of legislation before Parliament that she had opinions about, and he admitted to having not yet fully formed his own. He had listened. That was the thing she kept returning to in the weeks after. When her mother noticed she was quieter than usual and asked what she was thinking about, he had listened. "He's a duke." Her mother said the word, carrying no particular weight, simply a fact to be noted. "He'll have expectations." "Every man I've met has expectations, Mother." Helen had not looked up from her needlework. The question is whether he's the kind of man who's open to being surprised by what he actually gets. She had believed Richard was that kind of man. For several years, she had been right. Their wedding had been held at the Langford family church in Yorkshire, which her mother had fought for, and her father had ultimately agreed to, because, as he put it, there was no particular advantage to holding it in London, and several advantages to holding it in a place where the Langford name meant something immediate and legible. Richard had arrived at the ceremony looking. She would always remember this, like a man who had decided something and was at peace with his decision. Not nervous. Not performing for the assembled guests. Simply present. At the altar before the vows. He had leaned slightly toward her and said quietly enough that only she could hear, "I may have inherited a title, but today I gained something far more valuable." She had looked at him. His expression was entirely serious. She had believed him. Arthur was born in the spring of their second year. The labor was long 17 hours, and somewhere in the small hours of the morning. Helen had gone to a place beyond social grace, beyond the careful management of appearances, beyond everything, except the immediate animal fact of what her body was doing. She had not cried. She had gripped the headboard and breathed and let the women around her do their work. Richard had been in the adjoining room for most of it, which was customary and expected. But at 3 o'clock in the morning, when the doctor allowed it, he had come in, and he had sat beside the bed and taken her hand, both her hands actually covering them completely with his, and he had stayed. He had been there when Arthur arrived. He had looked at the child in Helen's arms with an expression she had never seen on his face before or since. Something stripped clean of everything learned or performed, something completely unguarded. "You gave me the greatest gift anyone could give," he had said. She had been too exhausted to answer, but she had believed him then too. The crisis came in their 4th year. Richard had inherited, along with the title and the land and the position, a financial situation that was considerably less stable than it appeared from the outside. His father, charming, generous, profoundly disorganized, had made a series of investment decisions in the 1870s that had seemed sound at the time, and had proved over the following decade to be anything but. By the time Helen married into the Winthrop estate, the situation was manageable, but precarious, the kind of financial ground that required constant attention and very careful navigation. Helen had understood this from the beginning. Her father had made certain she understood the financial realities of what she was marrying into, because he was a man who believed ignorance was never actually protection, only delayed reckoning. She had gone into the marriage with clear eyes. What she had not anticipated was the depth of the problem, which revealed itself gradually over the first 3 years as she worked through the estate accounts with Richard's solicitor and her own considerable education in land management. By the 4th year, it was evident that without significant reorganization of both the agricultural holdings and the coal interests in the north, the Winthrop estate would not sustain itself through the next decade. Richard knew this. It was why he spent long weeks in London, meeting with investors and members of Parliament, working the political angles of a problem that was at least partly political in nature. It was necessary work. Helen did not resent it. What she did while he was doing that work was manage everything else. She restructured the tenant arrangements on the 3 largest Winthrop farms, not cutting rents, which would have been the easy and destructive path, but renegotiating the terms in ways that improved productivity and reduced operating costs simultaneously. She brought in an agricultural consultant from Lincolnshire, whom she had heard her father discuss, a man who had turned around 2 struggling estates, and who, once he understood what Helen was asking him to look at, said something she filed carefully in her memory. "Your Grace, in 20 years of this work, I've met perhaps 4 women who understood land at this level. You're one of them." She reorganized the coal interests with the help of her father's solicitor. Her father's, not Richard's, because she trusted the man, and because the 2 firms operating the Winthrop coal holdings had been taking certain liberties with their reporting that required a legal eye to disentangle. By the end of the 4th year, the estate was stable. Not prosperous, that would take another 2 years, but genuinely structurally stable, no longer the kind of ground that gave way unexpectedly underfoot. Richard had come home from his final London trip of that year to find the solicitor's summary waiting on his desk. He had found Helen in the sitting room, and he had embraced her, not the careful social embrace of a husband who is pleased with his wife's behavior, but the grip of a man who had been genuinely frightened and had been relieved of that fear. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he had said against her hair. She had held him back with equal force, but he had been talking about the estate. She understood that now, sitting in a carriage moving through the dark Yorkshire countryside, the rosewood box on the seat beside her. He had been grateful for what she had accomplished. He had not been talking about her. The distance had come in gradually. The way cold comes into a house when the fires are banked low, not dramatically, not with any single identifiable moment, but as a slow shift in temperature that you adjust to before you fully understand what you're adjusting to. Richard began spending more time in London in the 5th year. This was not unusual for a man of his position. Parliament sat for months. There were social obligations. There was business. Helen did not question it. She managed the estate raised. Arthur maintained the household, attended the local social calendar that required the Duchess of Winthrop to be visible and engaged. But the dinners she had with Richard when he was home grew quieter, not hostile. Richard was never hostile to her, simply less present. He answered her questions about London with summaries rather than stories. He stopped asking about the estate with any real curiosity, trusting that she would tell him if something required his attention. He was courteous. He was considerate of her comfort. He simply seemed to have moved the interesting parts of himself somewhere else. She had tried in the 6th year to address it directly. They had been sitting in the library after dinner, one of the rare evenings when they were both home and the staff had cleared away, and there was nothing immediately required of either of them, and Helen had set down her book and said, "Richard, I'd like to talk about us." He had looked up from his papers. "What about us? I think we've grown distant." She kept her voice steady because she had decided ahead of time that this conversation needed to happen without accusation, without drama, as a simple observation between two people who were supposed to be partners. "I don't mean that as a criticism. I think it's happened gradually to both of us, but I'd like to change it." He had looked at her for a long moment. "Helen." His voice was measured. "We have a son. We have a functioning estate. We maintain a respected position in society. What exactly do you feel is missing?" She had stared at him. Not because the question was cruel, she did not think he meant it to be cruel, but because the fact that he could ask it, could genuinely not understand what she was pointing at, told her more about how far they had drifted than anything she might have said in response. "I see," she had said. And she had picked up her book again. She had told herself that it was a difficult season. She had told herself that men of Richard's position carried pressures that were not always visible. She had told herself that marriages passed through difficult seasons, and that the measure of a marriage was not the absence of difficulty, but the willingness to move through it together. She had told herself these things, and she had believed them, and she had stayed. Duchess. The name Clara Beaumont had first appeared in her awareness 8 months ago. Not from Richard. From Lady Ashworth at a dinner in Harrogate. An offhand remark, the kind that is sometimes offhand and sometimes very deliberately placed. "I saw your husband at Covent Garden last Thursday," Lady Ashworth had said, not looking at Helen, but at the centerpiece. "He seemed to be enjoying himself tremendously. Lovely opera, did he tell you about it? He mentioned it." Helen had not missed a beat. Richard had mentioned attending an opera. He had not mentioned who he attended with. "Miss Beaumont has a remarkable voice," Lady Ashworth had continued. "She's quite sought after these days. I believe she and your husband are acquainted." "Richard has a great appreciation for music," Helen had said, and had moved the conversation elsewhere, and had spent the rest of the dinner managing her face with the same careful expertise she applied to everything else. She had not confronted Richard directly. Looking back, she could not fully explain why, perhaps because she had told herself she might be wrong, or perhaps because she understood at some level that a direct confrontation would force a reckoning she was not yet ready to have. She had watched. She had listened to the silences and the absences and the subtle reorganization of his time. She had noted things and said nothing, and continued to manage the estate and raise Arthur and be the Duchess of Winthrop. She had believed somehow that if she continued to be everything the role required, the rest would resolve itself. She understood sitting in the carriage with the Yorkshire dark on all sides and the wooden box waiting patiently on the seat beside her. How profoundly she had been wrong. Langford House was dark at this hour, except for the study window on the ground floor, which was always lit when her father was working late. He kept country hours, her father. Early mornings, late evenings, the pattern of a man who had spent decades in Parliament and never entirely shed the habit of late work. The carriage stopped at the front door. Helen climbed down. She thanked Thomas and told him to go home for the night, and she stood at the front door of her childhood home in the dark for a moment before knocking. Her father's manservant opened the door within 30 seconds. "Your Grace." Genuine surprise on the old man's face. "We weren't expecting. Is my father still awake?" "In his study, Your Grace. Shall I announce?" "No." She was already moving past him. "No, I'll go myself." Edward Langford was 72 and had the bearing of a man who had spent decades in rooms where important things were decided. He was not a sentimental man by nature, not cold, but organized around principle rather than feeling, and accustomed to approaching problems by identifying their components rather than their emotional weight. When his daughter opened the study door without knocking, which she had not done since she was a child, he set down his pen. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Sit down, Helen." She sat. She placed the rosewood box on the edge of his desk in the small, clear space between the stack of correspondence and the reading lamp. She did not explain it. He did not ask. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Not with drama. Not with tears. She was not ready for tears, she thought, or perhaps she was simply past the kind of feeling that moves toward tears and into something harder and more permanent. She told him what she had heard, and what she had understood from hearing it, and what she had done. Edward Langford listened without interrupting. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Her father looked at the rosewood box for a moment. Then he looked at her. Richard Winthrop. He said the name, carrying the particular quality of something being carefully assessed, has made a very serious error in judgment. Yes. He cannot possibly believe this will not have consequences. I don't know what he believes. She paused. I'm not sure I ever fully understood what he believed. Her father was quiet again. Then, with the careful, measured tone of a man who knew what he should say and what he wanted to say and was navigating between them. Helen, you must think carefully about what you want to do. A formal separation. Father. Her voice was quiet, but entirely clear. I am not asking for your advice tonight. I am telling you what happened, and I am asking to sleep in my old room. Edward Langford looked at his daughter. After a moment he stood. He was still a tall man. Your room is always your room, he said. It will always be your room. He walked around the desk and embraced her briefly and firmly, the way he had embraced her when she was small and had fallen. An embrace that did not require words and did not offer solutions, but simply acknowledged that something real had happened and that she was not alone in it. Helen held on for a moment longer than she expected to. Then she stepped back, picked up the rosewood box from his desk, and went upstairs to her old room, where the bed was made with clean linen, and the window looked out over the garden that had not changed in 30 years. And she sat on the edge of the bed in her evening clothes with the box in her lap. She did not open it. She sat with it in the dark for a long time, listening to the sounds of a house she had grown up in, different from Winthrop Hall, familiar in a different way. The sounds of a place where she had existed before she was anyone's wife, and she thought about the engraving on the back of the watch. 7 years. Still yours. H. She thought about the woman in the drawing room laughing the easy laugh of someone who believed she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She thought about Richard's voice, the certainty in it, the complete absence of guilt. My mistress deserves the place you failed to keep. Helen looked at the box in her hands. Then very slowly and very deliberately she set it on the nightstand. She would not give him the watch. Not because she was angry, she was, but that was not the reason. She would not give him the watch because the engraving was a lie now, and she did not give anyone things that were no longer true. She had given Richard Winthrop 7 years of her intelligence, her labor, her patience, her loyalty, and the careful protection of his name and his estate. She would not give him another thing. Not until she had decided with full clarity and no illusions exactly what she was going to do next. Margaret Langford was already awake when Helen came downstairs the next morning. This did not surprise Helen. Her mother had always been an early riser, and in 65 years of living, Margaret had developed the particular sensitivity of a woman who understood that the people she loved sometimes needed her most in the hours before the household fully woke. She was sitting at the breakfast table with her tea going cold and her hands folded in front of her. And when Helen appeared in the doorway, Margaret simply looked at her with eyes that already knew. "Your father told me," Margaret said. Helen sat down across from her. A servant appeared silently with fresh tea, set it beside her, and disappeared. "How much did he tell you?" "Enough." Margaret's voice was even. "He told me what you heard and what you did afterward." Helen wrapped both hands around the teacup. The warmth of it was the first physical comfort she had registered since the corridor at Winthrop Hall, and she held on to it longer than necessary. "I want to know," Margaret said carefully, "how long you've known something was wrong." Helen looked at her mother for a moment. Then she set down the cup. 8 months ago, Lady Ashworth mentioned Clara Beaumont at dinner. She paused. "I suspected then. I didn't know. And in those 8 months, I watched. I said nothing. I managed the estate and raised Arthur and attended every social obligation and told myself I might be wrong." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was not accusatory. It was the voice of a woman who had navigated the same social world for 40 years and understood exactly what it demanded. "I watched you do the same thing for 6 months before you said anything to your father or me." She reached across the table and put her hand over Helen's. "A woman in your position has been taught her whole life that endurance is a virtue, that a marriage is worth protecting at almost any cost. I know this because I taught you some of it myself." Helen looked at her mother's hand on hers. "You also taught me that a woman's dignity is not negotiable." "I did." Margaret's grip tightened slightly. "And I should have taught it louder." By 8 o'clock, Edward Langford had come to the breakfast table with the expression of a man who had spent the night thinking and had arrived at conclusions he was not entirely comfortable with. He sat. He took his coffee. He looked at his daughter for a moment with the careful gaze of someone measuring what she could bear. "I've been thinking about the practical realities," he said finally. "Father, let me finish." He set down his cup. "Richard Winthrop has made a serious error. I am not disputing that. What happened last night was, Helen, it was an insult to you and to this family that I do not intend to take lightly." His jaw tightened briefly, the only external sign of the anger he was containing. "But I want you to understand what a formal separation means in practical terms. It means scandal. It means Arthur growing up with a particular kind of public story about his parents. It means certain doors that are currently open will close." Helen listened to all of it without moving. "I understand that," she said when he finished. "Then you understand why I feel I must say carefully, and with the greatest respect for what you're feeling, that perhaps there is still a path toward resolution that doesn't require, Father." Her voice was quiet and entirely flat. "Richard told his mistress last night that she deserves the place I failed to keep. He said it in my home loud enough for me to hear it in the corridor, and I have no reason to believe it was anything other than deliberate." She paused. "I am not asking you to fight a war on my behalf. I am asking you to understand that the war is already over, and I lost it a long time ago. What I am doing now is not leaving my marriage. My marriage left me." Edward Langford looked at his daughter. The silence at the breakfast table was the kind that comes after something undeniably true has been said, when even the most careful pragmatist cannot find a reasonable counter-argument. Then Margaret Langford put down her teacup with a decisive sound that made both of them look at her. "Edward." Her voice carried the particular authority of a woman who had been listening to this family navigate its crises for 4 decades and had reached the end of a very long patience. "Our daughter walked out of her own home last night, carrying a gift she'd bought for a man who was telling another woman she was his real priority. She has managed his estate, raised his son, protected his name through 7 years of increasing neglect, and she is sitting at our table this morning, without having slept and without having cried, and you are talking to her about doors that might close." She looked at her husband steadily. "I want you to think about what you are saying." Edward Langford looked at his wife. Then he looked at his daughter. A long moment passed. "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry, Helen." It was not a complicated apology. It was not a long one, but it was the apology of a man who was genuinely revising something, not simply managing the situation, and Helen recognized the difference. "Thank you, Father." The first letter from Winthrop Hall arrived that afternoon. Not from Richard himself, from his secretary, a man named Pharaoh, who had been with the household for 3 years, and who wrote in the precise, careful style of someone conveying a message from a superior who has not given him adequate information about the emotional landscape of the situation. His Grace inquires as to the Duchess's health and requests notification of her expected return to Winthrop Hall at her earliest convenience. His Grace also wishes to note that certain household matters require her attention. Helen read the letter twice. Then she folded it and placed it on her mother's writing desk. "He sent his secretary," she said. Margaret looked up from the letter. "Yes, he sent his secretary to ask when I'm coming home." Helen's voice was quite calm. "Not a personal letter. Not himself. His secretary. What would you like to do?" Helen thought about it for exactly as long as it took to pick up the pen from the writing stand. She wrote back in her own hand 4 lines. "Mr. Pharaoh, please inform His Grace that the Duchess of Winthrop is attending to a family matter at Langford House and will return at a time of her own determination. Please also inform His Grace that household matters of immediate urgency may be directed to Mr. Holt, the estate manager, whose competence in such matters has been well established over the past 4 years. HLW." She sealed it and handed it to the footman before her mother could read it. Margaret watched the footman leave with the letter. 4 lines, she observed. 4 was sufficient. Richard's second communication arrived 2 days later, and this time it was in his own hand. Helen recognized his handwriting on the envelope immediately, the particular slant of it, the way he formed his capital letters with a slight backward lean that she had always found oddly characteristic of his personality. That slight resistance to full commitment, even in something as small as penmanship. She opened the letter standing at the window of her childhood bedroom, the same window that looked out over the garden that had not changed. "Helen, I understand that you are upset. I will not attempt to explain or minimize what happened, as I know you well enough to understand that would not be well received. I would ask only that you consider Arthur's situation and the practicalities of your return as an extended absence will invite questions that neither of us wants to answer publicly. I am certain we can discuss this as sensible adults when you are ready to do so. R." She read it 3 times. The word that kept landing with the weight of something thrown was upset. She was upset. He had reduced 7 years and 1 shattering night to upset, and he wanted to discuss it as sensible adults, by which he meant she understood perfectly that he wanted her to come home and resume her position and accept the situation as a married woman of her generation, and position was expected to accept it with grace, with silence, and with the particular kind of forgiveness that was really just an agreement never to speak of the thing again. She folded the letter precisely along its original creases and placed it in the drawer of the nightstand next to the rosewood box. Then she went downstairs and found her father in his study. "I need to speak with your solicitor," she told him. "Your man, not Richard's." Her father looked up from his desk. He read her face for a moment. "I'll send for him this afternoon," he said. The solicitor's name was Mr. Aldridge, and he had served the Langford family for 20 years, which meant he had known Helen since she was 12 years old and had watched her develop into one of the most formidably clear-thinking clients he had ever worked with, despite the fact that as a married woman of her era, her legal position was considerably more constrained than her actual capabilities deserved. He arrived at Langford House the following morning, sat across from Helen in the small parlor her mother used for private meetings, and listened for 20 minutes without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "I want to be honest with you about the legal landscape, because I don't believe you are served by anything other than full honesty. That's exactly why I called you rather than anyone else. A formal separation, which is the realistic option in the current legal framework, would not automatically transfer custody of your son. A court would consider Arthur's interests, which in practice means he would likely remain in his father's household as the heir. Your access to him would be determined by terms that Richard has significant influence over. He paused. Your financial position would also be affected. Your dowry arrangements are quite solid. Your father was very thorough, but your daily management of the Winthrop estate is a practical role rather than a legal one. Richard could theoretically replace you in that function. Helen sat with all of this for a moment. And if I return to Winthrop Hall and do nothing? Then the legal situation remains unchanged, which means you retain your position as Duchess, your practical authority over the household, and your proximity to your son. He hesitated. But you will be returning to a household in which your husband has made his priorities quite clear. Yes. Helen looked at the window. Mr. Aldridge, what I need from you is not a recommendation about what to do. I need to understand exactly what each choice costs and what it preserves. I need the full picture. That's a very sensible approach. It is the only approach I know how to take. She turned back to him. What do I actually own, not what I manage? What is mine? He opened his folder. The answer, once Mr. Aldridge laid it out in full, was both less and more than Helen had expected. Her dowry had been settled in a structure that her father, characteristically thorough, characteristically realistic about the world his daughter would inhabit, had insisted on at the time of the marriage. The principal was protected. The income from it was legally hers. It was not a fortune by Winthrop standards, but it was not nothing, and it was unambiguously her own. Additionally, there was the matter of her mother's personal estate, which Margaret had structured separately from her husband's holdings, for reasons that Helen now understood were not accidental. And there was the question of the Langford family's position in the broader political and financial network that Richard Winthrop had over 7 years quietly come to rely upon the connections her father had cultivated in Parliament. The business relationships that flowed through the Langford name, the social endorsements that had smoothed certain of Richard's ambitions into reality. Helen thought about all of this very carefully on the afternoon that Mr. Aldridge left. She was not thinking about revenge. She was not thinking about punishment. She was thinking with the same clear-eyed precision she had applied to the Winthrop estate accounts in their 4th year of marriage about structure. About what sustained a position and what happened when that structure was withdrawn. Richard believed she would come home because she had nowhere else to go and nothing else to be. He had made the same mistake he made about the estate. He had confused the absence of visible alternatives with an absence of options. Arthur arrived at Langford House on the 4th day. Not alone, his nursemaid Mrs. Potter brought him in a carriage along with a brief note from Richard, indicating that the boy had been asking for his mother and that Richard thought a visit would be appropriate. Helen was at the front door before the carriage stopped moving. Arthur was 5 years old and had Richard's dark hair and her own gray eyes and a way of running that suggested he was always moving towards something he was certain would be worth getting to. He launched himself at her from 6 feet away, and she caught him with both arms and held on with a force that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the fact that in 4 days she had not allowed herself to fully understand how much she had missed him. "Mama." His voice was muffled against her shoulder. "Mrs. Potter said you were visiting Grandpapa." "I was. I am." She pulled back enough to look at his face. "Are you all right, my love?" "I found a frog in the garden." He was already moving on the way. 5-year-olds move on, because the present is always more interesting than anything adults are worrying about. "A large one. I named him Wellington." "That's an excellent name for a frog." Papa said it was silly. Helen looked at her son's face. He was not troubled by this. It was a statement of fact, not a complaint. The way children report information without yet knowing which information should hurt. "I think Wellington is a very distinguished name," she said firmly. Arthur grinned and squirmed to be put down, and she let him go and watched him run toward his grandfather, who was coming through the front door with the look of a man who had been informed a small force of nature was approaching and had prepared himself accordingly. Mrs. Potter stood by the carriage waiting with the particular patience of a woman who understood her role. "How is he?" Helen asked her quietly. "Truly." Mrs. Potter looked at her with the steady gaze of a woman who had worked in the Winthrop household for 3 years, and who was, Helen had long known, entirely trustworthy in the ways that mattered. He asks for you every evening, Mrs. Potter said, and every morning. He's been sleeping well, eating well. He doesn't understand something is wrong exactly. He only knows you aren't there. Helen absorbed this. And the household. A fractional pause. His Grace has been in residence. Miss Beaumont has not been present since... Another pause. Since the evening you left. Helen filed this information away without comment. Thank you, Mrs. Potter. Please stay as long as Arthur wants to stay. We'll arrange his return this evening. Arthur stayed for dinner. Watching him at the table talking too much, asking her father impossible questions about frogs and the House of Lords in the same breath, charming her mother into a second serving of pudding. She had not intended to allow. Helen felt something that existed somewhere between grief and clarity. She loved this child completely, and Arthur existed because of a marriage that had been real once, whatever it had become. She could not disentangle those two truths. She was not sure she wanted to. After dinner, after Arthur had been read to in the guest room by Mrs. Potter, and had fallen asleep with the immediate totality of a 5-year-old who has had a satisfying day, Helen came back downstairs and found both her parents in the sitting room. Her father had a particular expression, the one she recognized as the look of a man who has been having a very serious conversation that has not finished. "There's something I should have told you yesterday," he said before she could sit. "I received a visitor this morning, Lord Pemberton." Lord Pemberton was the third most senior peer in the Yorkshire circuit and had been a close ally of the Winthrop family for 2 decades. Helen sat down. "What did he want?" "He came to tell me privately, and with what I believe was genuine discomfort, that Richard has apparently been making certain representations in London to other members of the house." Edward chose his next words carefully. "He has been suggesting that any difficulties in his household are the result of his wife's instability, that you have been prone to erratic behavior, that your absence from Winthrop Hall is evidence of a fragile temperament that he has been quietly managing for some time." The room was very quiet. Helen looked at her father, then at her mother. Then she said with a steadiness that surprised even herself, "He's building the story before I can tell mine." "Yes," her father said, "that is exactly what he is doing." This was the moment. The moment where something that had been grief and humiliation became something else entirely. Not rage exactly, though there was rage in it. Something colder and more structural. Something that understood with complete precision what was actually happening and what it would require in response. Richard Winthrop was not simply a man who had been unfaithful. He was a man who, when confronted with the consequences of his choices, had decided that the safest strategy was to discredit the woman who had witnessed them. He was going to make her the problem. He was going to use every tool available to a man of his position and connections to transform what he had done into something she had caused. She had seen him manage difficult situations before. She had watched him work rooms, redirect narratives, apply the particular social intelligence of a man who had been raised to understand that the first version of a story was often the version that stuck. She had helped him do it sometimes. She had stood beside him at dinners and supported his version of events with her own composure and her own credibility and her own family name. He had just made the mistake of turning that machine toward her. "Father?" Her voice was entirely level. "I need you to host a dinner, next Thursday. I need you to invite Lord and Lady Pemberton, the Ashworths, the Hargroves, and the Carlyles. I need the right people in the same room, and I need to be present." Edward Langford looked at his daughter for a long moment. He had watched her manage the Winthrop estate back from the edge of insolvency. He had watched her navigate 7 years of a marriage that had demanded everything and returned less and less. He had watched her walk into this house 4 nights ago with a rosewood box in her hands and her marriage in pieces, and not shed a single visible tear. "Consider it done," he said. Margaret said nothing. But she looked at her daughter with an expression that was not quite pride, because pride was too simple for what was in it. It was the look of a woman who recognized in someone she had raised a quality that she understood and respected completely. The following morning, Richard arrived at Langford House in person. He did not send a letter first. He did not send his secretary. He arrived at 10 o'clock in the Winthrop carriage unannounced and was shown into the front parlor by the Langford footman, who had not been given instructions to deny him an oversight Helen immediately noted for future reference. She came downstairs to find him standing at the window, his back to the door with the posture of a man who had come here with a specific intention and was currently organizing himself around it. When she entered, he turned. 7 years of marriage meant she could read him in fractions. She saw the calculation behind the composed expression. She saw the brief assessment he made of her face, looking for signs of the fragile temperament he had apparently been describing to his colleagues in London. She saw the moment he decided she looked sufficiently controlled to be managed. Helen. He said her name with a warmth that did not reach the center of his eyes. I think we've both had enough time to think clearly. I'd like us to talk. She sat down in the chair nearest the door, not the one he had positioned himself to face, which would have placed her at a slight visual disadvantage, but the one that put her with the light behind her and her back straight. I am listening. He moved to the chair across from her. He did not sit immediately. He set one hand on the back of it in a way that was almost casual, the posture of a man who believes he is controlling the geography of the conversation. I want to apologize for what you heard, he began. I said things that were poorly chosen, and I understand that you're hurt. I genuinely do. You understand that I'm hurt. Yes. Richard. She kept her voice conversational. You told your mistress that she deserves the place I failed to keep. In our home, with the door open. You are apologizing for the phrasing. A brief pause, a fractional tightening around his eyes. I'm apologizing for the pain I caused you. You are apologizing for my emotional reaction to a deliberate choice. She tilted her head slightly. Those are different things. He exhaled. The warmth in his expression shifted to something more direct. Helen, I'm not going to pretend that everything has been perfect between us. We've both known for some time that our marriage has, he searched for the word, evolved in ways that are complicated. What I'm asking is that we approach this as adults who understand the real world. We have a son. We have a position. We have responsibilities that exist regardless of whatever has happened between us personally. We also, Helen said, have a situation in which you have apparently been informing Lord Pemberton and others in London that my current absence from Winthrop Hall is the result of an unstable temperament. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. Richard's expression went through several adjustments in quick succession before it settled into something deliberately neutral. I don't know what Pemberton has been. Please don't. Her voice was still perfectly even. Please don't tell me you don't know what Pemberton said, because I know that you do, and because I would prefer that whatever conversation we have today is honest, even if our marriage has not always been. He was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down. The calculation in his face was clearer now because he had stopped performing warmth and was operating on something more functional. You've always been the most intelligent woman I know, he said. It was offered as something between a compliment and an acknowledgement. Then speak to me as though that's true. Another pause. What do you want, Helen? She looked at him across the small distance of the parlor. This man who had held her hands through 17 hours of labor and said she had given him the greatest gift. This man who had embraced her when she brought his estate back from the edge of ruin. This man who had stood at an altar and meant something she still believed, even if what he meant had not lasted. I want you to understand, she said slowly, that I am not the woman you have been describing to your associates in London. I am not fragile, and I am not erratic, and the story you are constructing about me will not hold, because the people who matter in this conversation know the difference between a woman who has left her home and a woman who has been driven from it. Richard's jaw shifted. And I want you to understand, she continued in the same measured voice, that the Langford family's involvement in your political and financial interests is not a fixed condition. It is a relationship. And relationships require that both parties conduct themselves with a minimum of basic respect. There it was. The thing she had decided in the night after Mr. Aldridge had laid out the full picture after her father had told her about Lord Pemberton, after she had sat in the dark and thought about structure and what sustained it. Richard Winthrop heard it. She watched him hear it, watched the moment he understood that this was not a wife asking to be comforted. This was the Langford family speaking through the voice of a woman he had underestimated, laying out the actual terms of the situation. He was quiet for a long time. "You're serious," he said finally. "I have always been serious," Helen answered. "You simply chose not to take me seriously. I'd encourage you not to make the same mistake twice." He stood. He moved toward the window and stood with his back to her. For a moment, she recognized the gesture new. It was the way he collected himself when he had encountered something he had not prepared for. Then he turned back. "What do you want from me?" The question was different this time, stripped of strategy. "I want you to be honest with yourself, and then with me, about what you actually think this marriage is." She met his eyes steadily. "Not what it looks like from the outside, not what is convenient, what you actually believe it is." The clock on the parlor mantel marked the seconds between them. Richard Winthrop, who had managed rooms and people and situations for 20 years, who had never in Helen's memory been at a loss in a conversation, said nothing, because there was finally nothing convenient left to say. Richard left Langford House without the answer he had come for. Helen watched the Winthrop carriage pull away from the front drive and stood at the parlor window until it disappeared beyond the tree line. And then she stood there a little longer, not because she was watching for anything, but because she needed a moment in which nothing was required of her. The conversation had cost her something she couldn't name precisely. Not confidence, not resolve, but some quiet internal reserve that she had been drawing on since the night in the corridor, and she could feel the level dropping. Her mother appeared in the doorway behind her. "He's gone. He's gone." Margaret came into the room and sat in the chair Richard had occupied. She looked at it briefly, the way you look at something a stranger has touched, then turned her attention to her daughter. "How did he take it?" Helen turned from this window. "He took it the way Richard takes everything that doesn't go as planned. He reorganized. He recalculated. He left without committing to anything, because committing requires him to acknowledge the situation is real. And is he going to acknowledge it? Not yet." Helen sat down. The exhaustion was settling in now that the sharpness of the confrontation had passed. "But he heard me. That's enough for today." Margaret studied her face for a moment. "You're not sleeping." "I'm sleeping adequately." "You're sleeping the way you slept before exams at 16 technically, but not restoratively." Her mother's voice was matter-of-fact rather than worried, which was somehow more comforting. "Eat something this afternoon. Real food. You cannot fight this on tea and pride alone." Despite everything, Helen almost smiled. The Thursday dinner happened exactly as Edward Langford promised. He was, whatever his failings as a father in the first days of this crisis, extraordinarily good at the mechanics of social power. He had spent 50 years cultivating the specific kind of relationships that looked like friendship from the outside, and functioned like infrastructure from the inside. And when he needed those relationships to perform, they performed. Lord and Lady Pemberton arrived first. Lord Pemberton was a large, careful man who moved through social situations with the deliberate attention of someone who understood that information was the actual currency of his world, and he had been visibly uncomfortable since his conversation with Edward. The discomfort of a man who had delivered bad news and was uncertain whether he had done the right thing. Helen met him in the entrance hall before they moved to the drawing room. "Lord Pemberton." She extended her hand with complete composure. "I'm so glad you could come. I understand. I owe you a particular debt of thanks." He looked at her with the slightly startled expression of a man who had expected something more defensive. "Your Grace. My father told me you came to warn him." She kept her voice warm and direct. "That required a degree of personal courage that I don't take lightly. Thank you." Pemberton cleared his throat. I felt the situation warranted honesty." "It always does," Helen said, "though not everyone arrives at that conclusion." She moved on before he could respond, which was the correct strategy. Leave the compliment with no room for it to be complicated by further conversation. Lady Ashworth arrived with her husband at 7:30, and with her came the particular social energy of a woman who was very good at appearing to simply be enjoying a pleasant dinner while simultaneously absorbing and transmitting every significant piece of information in the room. Helen had known Lady Ashworth for 15 years. She understood exactly what the woman was capable of, which was why she had specifically asked her father to include her. The Hargroves and the Carlyles filled out the table. 8 guests in total, the precise number to make a dinner feel intimate and important, rather than like a public occasion. Helen sat at her father's right, which positioned her as the natural center of the table's attention, without requiring her to host. She wore the dark blue silk she had brought with her from Winthrop Hall. Not her finest dress, but one that Richard had once said suited her better than anything else she owned, which was the kind of specific compliment that stayed in memory precisely because it was specific. She wore her mother's pearls. She knew exactly like what she was, a woman of impeccable position who happened to be visiting her family. Over the first course, Lord Pemberton asked with the casual curiosity of a man raising a topic he had clearly intended to raise whether she had been well. Entirely well, thank you. She lifted her wine glass. I've been taking advantage of some time with my parents. One doesn't do that enough when the daily demands of an estate consume most of one's attention. Indeed. Pemberton's wife leaned forward slightly. And Winthrop Hall, everything is running smoothly. Everything I have overseen has run smoothly, Helen said with a smile that was pleasant and precise in equal measure. The estate manager, Mr. Holt, is a remarkable man. I chose him myself 3 years ago. I have every confidence in his capabilities. The implication was not subtle. It was not meant to be. She had overseen the estate. She had chosen the staff. The institution functioned because of the choices she had made and the systems she had built, and every person at this table was capable of understanding what that meant. Lady Ashworth's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. By the third course, the conversation had moved as Helen had quietly steered it to the topic of the upcoming parliamentary session, and Edward Langford had raised with thoughtful deliberateness several matters in which the Winthrop family's political interests intersected with decisions that would be made in the next few months. Matters in which the Langford family's support had historically been reliable. Pemberton listened carefully. Helen said almost nothing during this portion of the conversation. She didn't need to. Her father was doing what he did best, and the message was in the architecture of the dinner itself. The Langford family was present unified, and the question of where their loyalties would be directed was very much an open question. After dinner in the drawing room, Lady Ashworth appeared at Helen's elbow with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a woman who has been waiting for a private moment. "My dear." Lady Ashworth handed her a cup. "I want you to know, and I say this with genuine feeling, that the story Richard Winthrop has been telling does not hold water with anyone who actually knows you." Helen looked at her steadily. "I appreciate that. I also want you to know that I am aware I was perhaps careless at Harrogate when I mentioned Miss Beaumont." Lady Ashworth's voice dropped. "I should have spoken to you more directly. I am sorry for that." This surprised Helen slightly. Lady Ashworth was not by nature a woman who apologized easily. "You said enough for me to pay attention," Helen said. "That mattered." "Well," Lady Ashworth squared her shoulders, "I intend to be considerably less subtle going forward, if there is anything useful I can do." "Keep telling the truth," Helen said simply. "That's the only thing that's actually useful." The dinner accomplished what it needed to accomplish. Helen knew this, not because anyone said so directly, but because of what happened in the 2 weeks that followed. 2 of Richard's London associates, men who had been part of the political network that the Langford family quietly underpinned, made formal calls at Langford House to pay their respects to Edward. Lord Pemberton declined an invitation to attend a private gathering that Richard hosted at his London club. The Carlyles, who had a daughter they were considering presenting to society, the following season, asked Margaret Langford for her counsel on the matter, rather than consulting through the usual Winthrop-adjacent channels. None of this was dramatic. None of it was public. It was the slow, precise movement of social tides, invisible from a distance, unmistakable to anyone paying attention from within the current. Helen paid attention. She also wrote to Mr. Aldridge and asked him to prepare a full accounting of every financial and legal element of her position, not because she had decided what to do, but because she had learned from 7 years of estate management that you did not make good decisions without complete information, and she was not going to make the most important decision of her life from a position of partial understanding. Arthur came to Langford House 3 times that week, each time with Mrs. Potter, each time looking slightly more settled, which told Helen that whatever was happening at Winthrop Hall was at least maintaining the surface routines that a 5-year-old required. He had renamed his frog. Wellington had become Admiral Wellington following a conversation with Edward Langford that apparently involved a detailed account of the Battle of Waterloo, delivered to a deeply attentive child audience. Grandpapa says the Admiral never retreated, Arthur informed Helen gravely at breakfast on his 3rd visit. Grandpapa is correct. Are you going to retreat? Helen looked at her son, 5 years old, with her gray eyes and his father's dark hair, asking a question with the uncomplicated directness of someone who did not yet know that some questions were complicated. No, she said. I'm not. Arthur nodded, satisfied, and returned to his eggs. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and it was not from Richard. It was from Clara Beaumont. Helen recognized the name on the outside of the envelope before she opened it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the name was written in full without title or address, with the slightly self-conscious formality of someone who was aware they were doing something unusual. Helen took the letter to her mother's private sitting room, closed the door, and opened it. It was 3 pages written in a hand that was educated but not aristocratic, the hand of a woman who had been well trained in certain accomplishments without the full apparatus of a great house's education behind them. Miss Beaumont wrote that she had not known when she first came to Richard's attention that the circumstances of his marriage were as they were. She wrote that she chose the word, carefully misled. She wrote that she did not expect forgiveness and was not asking for it. She wrote that she had ended her connection with Richard 10 days ago, following a conversation in which he had said certain things that had made her understand the full nature of the situation she had placed herself in. She wrote, I do not tell you this to excuse myself. I tell you because I believe you deserve to know that whatever he told you about me, and I suspect he has told you things, I am not your enemy. I made choices that hurt you without fully understanding the harm they would cause, and I am sorry for that. Helen read the letter twice. Then she sat with it for a long time. She thought about the woman whose laughter she had heard through the drawing-room door. The easy, comfortable laugh of someone who believed she was where she was supposed to be. She had constructed Clara Beaumont in her mind as a certain kind of person. The kind of person it was simpler to be angry at than at the man who had arranged the entire situation. The letter complicated that construction. She did not forgive Clara Beaumont. Forgiveness was not something that arrived in a morning after 3 pages of honest writing. But she recognized something in the letter, the particular quality of a woman who had realized she had been used and was trying to reckon with that honestly, and she found she could not maintain the full force of her anger at someone who was doing that reckoning. She folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with Richard's letter and the rosewood box. Then she went to find her father. He's ended it with her, she told Edward, standing in the doorway of his study, with the clarity of someone reporting information that requires immediate analysis. Her father looked up. You're certain? She wrote to me directly. Helen came into the room. I believe she's telling the truth. She's not the sort of woman who would write that letter to deceive me. There's no advantage in it for her. Edward turned this over. Richard cut her loose because the situation became untenable. Not because of conscience. Almost certainly. Which means he's now focused entirely on managing the damage to his public position. Her father sets down his pen. He'll make another approach, soon, and it will be more structured than the last one. Helen sat down. Yes. How do you want to handle it? I want to handle it on my terms, not in the parlor of this house where he can frame it as a private family matter. Not in London where he has the advantage of his own territory. Her father waited. I want to handle it at Winthrop Hall, she said. I want to go back. Edward Langford's expression shifted, not alarm exactly, but a careful reassessment. That's a significant move. Yes. But Mr. Aldridge was right about one thing. The longer I am away, the more the narrative drifts toward whatever version Richard is constructing. My position is in that house. My son is in that house. My authority over that estate is practical and real, and if I abandon the ground, I lose the ground." She paused then. "And I need Richard to understand something that he cannot understand from a distance. I need him to see it in person." "What do you need him to see?" Helen looked at her father steadily. "That I am not afraid of him, and that his house runs because of me, not the other way around." She returned to Winthrop Hall on a Thursday morning, which was a deliberate choice. Thursday was the day Mr. Holt conducted his weekly staff review. Thursday was the day the accounts were reconciled and the week's household decisions were confirmed. Thursday was the most logistically significant day of the Winthrop Hall week, because it was the day Helen had always used to ensure everything ran correctly, and every member of the household staff knew this. She arrived at 10 o'clock. Mrs. Baxter, the housekeeper, was at the front door before the carriage stopped because Mrs. Baxter, who had served the Winthrop household for 18 years and had watched 3 duchesses manage 3 different varieties of impossible domestic situation, had clearly been informed by some internal staff communication network that the Duchess was returning and had prepared accordingly. "Your Grace." Genuine relief in the woman's voice. "Welcome home." "Thank you, Mrs. Baxter." Helen stepped inside. "Please tell Mr. Holt I'll meet with him at 11, and please let His Grace know I've arrived." She walked through the entrance hall and up the main staircase with the practiced ease of a woman who had lived in this house for 7 years and knew exactly where she was going. Behind her, she could feel the household reorganizing around her, return the particular shift that happens in a large house when the person who actually runs it comes back. Richard found her in the small study she used for estate work 20 minutes after her arrival. She was already at the desk, reviewing the correspondence that had accumulated in her absence, which was substantial because Mr. Holt was an excellent estate manager, but the diplomatic and social correspondence was hers, and always had been. "I didn't expect you today." Richard stood in the doorway. He had not knocked. Helen looked up from the correspondence. "I didn't announce myself. That was intentional." He came into the room. He looked, she thought, slightly different from the man who had sat across from her in her father's parlor, less composed or composed differently, the way a person looks when they have been managing something difficult alone, and it is beginning to show. "I want to talk about what happens next," he said. "So do I." She set down the letter she had been reading. "Sit down, Richard." He sat. The dynamic of the room was different from the parlor at Langford House. They were in her working space, surrounded by the documentation of everything she managed, and she was on the correct side of the desk. "Clara Beaumont wrote to me," she said, watching his face. The composure fractured briefly and completely before he reconstructed it. "Helen, she told me you ended the connection 10 days ago." Helen kept her voice entirely neutral. "I'm not raising this to relitigate what happened. I'm raising it because it tells me something about where you are right now, and I want to be working with accurate information." He was quiet for a moment. "I ended it because the situation had become untenable." "I know why you ended it." She looked at him directly. "The question is what you intend to do now." He met her eyes. This, she thought, was the first completely honest moment they had had no performance from either of them, no strategy. Just 2 people who had been married for 7 years, sitting across from each other with the actual shape of their situation between them. "I want to save this marriage," he said. She had expected this. She had prepared for it. And yet hearing it said directly without elaboration or qualification landed with more weight than she had anticipated, because the part of her that still remembered the man at the altar and the man who had held her hands through the long night of Arthur's birth recognized the statement as something real, even if what surrounded it was complicated. "Why?" Her voice was steady. "Tell me the actual reason. Not the children, not the position, not the politics. The actual reason." He looked at her for a long time. "Because I lost sight of what I had," he said finally. "And I don't want to spend the rest of my life knowing I threw it away for nothing." It was not a declaration of love. It was not an apology for the full weight of what he had done. It was the beginning of a sentence that had a great deal more to say before it would be worth anything. But it was honest. And Helen, who had spent 7 years married to a man who was rarely fully honest, recognized honesty when it arrived. She did not respond immediately. She let the statement sit in the room for a moment, the way you let something breathe before you assess its full weight. Then from the corridor outside came the sound of small running feet that both of them knew, followed by Mrs. Potter's voice. "Master Arthur, the Duchess is working." And then the door, which Richard had not fully closed behind him, swung open, and Arthur appeared in the gap, slightly out of breath, with the expression of a child who had been told something was off limits and had decided to verify this himself. He saw his mother. His entire face changed. "Mama." He crossed the room in 4 steps and climbed without ceremony into her lap, wrapping his arms around her with the complete, uncomplicated force of a child who has missed something and is now correcting that situation. Helen held him. Over the top of his dark head, she looked at Richard. Richard was watching his son with an expression she had not seen on his face since the night Arthur was born, that stripped, unguarded thing, the one that had nothing learned or performed in it. She thought about what she had said to her father. That she needed Richard to see something in person that he could not understand from a distance. She thought perhaps this was part of what she had meant. Not the desk and the correspondence and the authority over the household, though, all of that mattered. But this, that the 3 of them occupied the same space, and that whatever had been broken between the adults in the room, the child between them was real and present, and had not been consulted about any of it. "I'm home," she told Arthur quietly, her arms around him. "For good." He pulled back to look at her face with the searching attention of a child who has learned that adult answers require verification. She looked at her son. She looked at Richard. "For now," she said carefully, "we are going to work some things out." Arthur considered this with the grave seriousness of a 5-year-old processing complex information. "Does that mean Admiral Wellington can come inside?" Helen blinked. "Is Admiral Wellington still in the garden?" "He lives under the 3rd rose bush," Arthur said with complete authority. "I visit him every morning." "Admiral Wellington," Helen said, "may come inside on the condition that he is kept in an appropriate receptacle and does not frighten Mrs. Baxter." Arthur's expression suggested this was an excellent negotiated outcome. He climbed down and left the room at the same velocity at which he had entered it, already calling for Mrs. Potter. The room was quiet again. Richard was looking at the empty doorway his son had just moved through. Something in his face was working through something. She could see the motion of it, even if she couldn't read the destination. "Helen." His voice was different, quieter. "I know that what I did." He stopped. Tried again. "I know that an apology is not sufficient for what I did." "No," she said, "it isn't. But I am genuinely asking for the opportunity to show you something different." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the corridor, the open door, the sound of a woman laughing, the weight of the rosewood box in her hands, and the terrible clarity of what she had heard. She thought about the 8 months she had watched and said nothing. The 6th year in the library, when she had put down her book and tried to reach him, and he had asked her what was missing, as though the answer were genuinely not apparent. She thought about Arthur, 4 years old, asking why Papa didn't come home for dinner, and herself explaining in the careful language of a mother who is protecting a child from an adult reality he should not have to carry. She thought about Mr. Aldridge laying out her options with perfect honesty, about her father saying your room is always your room, about her mother putting down her teacup with that decisive sound and saying things that should have been said years earlier. She thought about Clara Beaumont's letter, 3 pages of honest reckoning from a woman who had been used by the same man who was now sitting across from her. And she thought about what she had said to Arthur. "We are going to work some things out." "An opportunity," she said at last, "is not the same as a promise, and an opportunity has conditions." "I understand." "I don't think you do yet." She met his eyes steadily. "But you will." Outside the study window, she could hear Arthur's voice in the garden, enthusiastically directing Mrs. Potter toward the 3rd rosebush. The ordinary sounds of a house that was still standing, still running, still holding the people inside it. Helen picked up the letter she had set down when Richard arrived. She did not tell him he could leave. She simply returned to her work, which was the clearest possible statement about whose house this was and who was in charge of the ground beneath both their feet. Richard sat for a moment longer. Then he stood. Then he left. The door this time he closed carefully behind him. Helen set down the letter again. She pressed both palms flat against the surface of the desk, her desk in her study. In the house she had managed for 7 years and breathed slowly until the trembling in her hands stopped. Then she straightened her back, picked up her pen, and went back to work. The conditions arrived in writing. Helen had thought about this carefully, not overnight, not in one sitting, but over the course of 4 days back inside Winthrop Hall. 4 days of resuming her work at her desk, while Richard moved through the house with the careful quietness of a man who understood he was on trial and had not yet been told the verdict. She had watched him. She had watched the way he spoke to the staff more deliberately than before, with a considered courtesy that she recognized as effortful rather than natural. She had watched the way he handled Arthur at dinner, more present than he had been in years, pulling the boy into conversations with genuine attention rather than the distracted half-engagement that had become his habit. She had watched all of this without commenting on it because she was not going to reward visible effort as though visible effort were the same thing as actual change. On the 5th morning, she placed a folded letter on his desk before he came down to breakfast. He found it when he came into the study at 8 o'clock. She was already in her own study, so she did not see him open it, but she heard because the walls of Winthrop Hall were old, and sounds traveled through them in ways the original architect had not anticipated, the particular silence that follows a man reading something he did not expect. The letter contained 4 things. First, Richard would make no further representations to his associates in London or anywhere else, suggesting that Helen's departure from Winthrop Hall had been the result of emotional instability. Any such representation already made would be corrected through whatever means he considered most effective, and Helen would be informed of what correction had been made and how. Second, the management of the Winthrop estate would be formally documented as Helen's responsibility in writing with Mr. Aldridge's firm, producing the relevant paperwork. Not because she needed the document to do the work she had been doing it for years without documentation, but because the document would exist and its existence mattered. Third, Richard would not bring any guest to Winthrop Hall without Helen's prior knowledge and agreement. This applied to all guests. The language was precise and left no category of exception. Fourth, they would resume attending social engagements together. Not because she required him as an escort, but because she required him to stand beside her in public and demonstrate by his visible presence and behavior that the narrative he had been building was false. She had not written an apology requirement, not because she didn't want one, but because a demanded apology was worth nothing, and she had decided she was not going to fill her life with things that were worth nothing. She heard him come down the corridor toward her study 20 minutes after he had read it. He knocked this time. "Come in." He entered with the letter in his hand. He stood for a moment looking at her. "These are the conditions," he said. "They are. You've discussed them with Aldridge." "With Aldridge and with my father, yes." He was quiet. She watched him working through it. Not the resistance of a man who intended to refuse, but the more complex processing of a man who was reading the full implications of each item and understanding what they meant about how she saw the situation. The third condition. He set the letter on the edge of her desk. "No guests without your prior knowledge." "You mean Clara." "I mean all guests." Helen met his eyes directly. "But yes, I also mean Clara." "I ended that." "I know, and I believe you. The condition exists anyway." She kept her voice even. "Not because I expect you to break it, because its existence is part of what it means to actually change the structure of how this household operates." He picked up the letter again. He looked at it for a moment. "All right," he said. 2 words. No negotiation, no attempt to modify or qualify. Helen had been prepared for a counteroffer, had prepared her response to it, and the simple agreement landed differently than she had expected, not as a relief exactly, but as information. He was not here to haggle. Whatever he had decided in the days since her return, he had decided it with some completeness. "Then we begin there," she said. The first correction to his London narrative happened within the week. Richard hosted a small luncheon at his club, not a large public occasion, but a gathering of 8 men whose opinions operated like infrastructure in the Yorkshire political and financial world, including Lord Pemberton and 2 others who had been recipients of his earlier characterizations of Helen. Helen was not present because she was not a member of the club, and because her presence was not the point. The point was Richard saying to these men in person what he had previously said to them in distortion. Pemberton reported back to Edward Langford the following afternoon. Edward came to Winthrop the morning after that, on the pretext of seeing Arthur, which was genuine, but not the whole of it, and found Helen in the garden, watching her son conduct what appeared to be a formal military inspection of Admiral Wellington's current accommodations. Pemberton says Richard was direct, Edward told her. He told them that he had given certain associates an inaccurate impression of your state of mind during a difficult period, and that this impression was wrong. He said it without elaboration, and without making it into a dramatic confession. Pemberton said it was a brief pause. He said it was in his estimation the most uncomfortable thing he had seen Richard Winthrop do in 20 years of knowing him. Helen watched Arthur crouch down to conduct a closer inspection of his frog. Good. Her voice was quiet. That's exactly what it should have been. Her father looked at her profile for a moment. You are harder than you used to be. I am clearer than I used to be. She turned to look at him. It's not the same thing. He nodded slowly. He was a man who understood the distinction. Mrs. Baxter came to Helen the second week with the expression of a woman who is carrying information she has been debating whether to share. Helen was reviewing correspondence at the small desk in her sitting room when the housekeeper appeared in the doorway. She recognized the expression immediately. Mrs. Baxter had a particular way of standing when she was carrying something important. A slight forward lean that was barely perceptible but entirely readable to someone who had worked alongside her for 6 years. What is it, Mrs. Baxter? The housekeeper came in and closed the door. Your Grace, I want to tell you something I perhaps should have told you before everything happened. She paused. Miss Beaumont was here more than once. It wasn't just one visit. His Grace brought her 3 times over the course of, I believe, 6 months or so. Each time she was introduced as a guest of His Grace's, and I was given to understand, not in so many words but clearly, that her visits were not to be communicated to you. Helen set down her pen. She had known in an abstract way that there was more she didn't know. But hearing the specificity of it, 3 visits, 6 months. A deliberate instruction given to her own household staff landed differently than the abstract knowledge. I want you to know, Mrs. Baxter continued, that I was not comfortable with those instructions. I want you to know that. Helen looked at the woman who had run her household for 6 years, who had managed the practical realities of everything from major dinner parties to Arthur's childhood illnesses, who had been given instructions behind her back in her own house. I appreciate you telling me. She kept her voice entirely steady. Is there anything else you believe I should know? Mrs. Baxter hesitated for only a moment. No, Your Grace, that's the whole of it. Then we won't speak of it again unless you have reason to raise it. Helen picked up her pen. Thank you, Mrs. Baxter. The housekeeper left. Helen stared at the correspondence in front of her without seeing it. 3 visits, 6 months. Instructions given to her own staff. She thought about everything she had managed in those 6 months. The tenant negotiations, the correspondence, the dinners, the public appearances. She had been running his household and raising his son and protecting his name while he was giving instructions to her housekeeper behind her back. She pressed her hand flat on the desk. She breathed until the sharpness of it receded to something she could work alongside. Then she went to find Richard. She found him in the library with what appeared to be genuine purpose. He was reviewing documents from his solicitor, the kind of estate review that she had previously always prompted him to do and that he had now apparently initiated himself. He looked up when she came in. He read her face in the way he had always been able to read her face, even in the years when he had chosen not to act on what he read there, and he put down the documents. Tell me, he said. Mrs. Baxter told me that Clara was here 3 times, over 6 months, and that you instructed the staff not to tell me. He did not look away. He did not reach for an explanation or a qualification. Yes. One word. No decoration. Helen stood in the center of the library. I want you to understand what that means to me. Not the visits I already knew about those in their essence, but the instructions to the staff. You turned the people who work in my household into participants in deceiving me. Her voice was very controlled. These are people I work alongside every day, people I trust. You used that trust against me. I know. I want to hear you say what you did, not an acknowledgement, a statement. I was quiet for a moment. Then, I brought a woman I was involved with into our home repeatedly, and I instructed our household staff to keep this from you. I did this deliberately while you were managing my estate and raising my son. I knew it was wrong, and I did it anyway. The library was completely silent. Helen looked at him for a long time. She was not looking for remorse in his expression, or rather she was. But she was also looking for something more durable than remorse. Some structural quality beneath the feeling that would tell her whether what he was doing was real. Remorse could be performed. She had been around powerful men her entire life, and she knew how well they could perform regret when it served them. What she was looking for was whether he understood. Fully, without softening. She decided looking at him that he was beginning to. Beginning to was not enough, but it was where they were. I am going to keep the conditions, she said, every one of them, and I am going to watch whether you keep them. I will keep them. If you don't, she paused, I will not come back a second time. You need to understand that as a simple fact, not as a threat. He held her gaze. I understand. She turned and left the library. Outside in the corridor, she stood for a moment with her back against the wall and her eyes closed, and simply breathed the way she had breathed the night she came home to find Langford House dark, except for her father's study window, gathering herself the way you gather something that has been scattered piece by piece until you have enough of it to move forward. The Pemberton dinner happened in the third week. It was the Pembertons' regular autumn gathering, the kind of event that had been on the social calendar for 15 years, and whose guest list was as carefully considered as any political appointment. Helen and Richard had attended together every year of their marriage. The question of whether they would attend this year had been, Helen understood the subject of considerable social speculation. They attended together. Helen wore the deep burgundy she had chosen for precisely this occasion, not because of the color, but because the gown had been made by her own dressmaker, and fit her with a precision that communicated everything she needed it to communicate without a word. She wore the Winthrop emeralds, which were technically hers by position, and which she had decided very deliberately to put on. Richard met her at the bottom of the stairs when she came down, and for a moment he simply looked at her. You look... He stopped. Thank you. She moved toward the door without waiting for him to finish because she had not dressed for his approval, and she wanted him to know it. In the carriage on the way to Pemberton House, they did not speak for the first 10 minutes. Not with hostility, simply with the particular quiet of two people who are about to do something requiring mutual performance, and are each preparing in their own way. Then Richard said without preamble, I'm going to stay close to you tonight, not for appearances, because I want to. Helen looked at the dark road through the carriage window. We'll see how the evening goes, she answered. He let that stand. The Pemberton gathering was 40 people in the good rooms of a house that had hosted Yorkshire society for 3 generations. Helen knew every person in those rooms had navigated this specific social world for 7 years, and walked into it now with the additional advantage of having been its subject for the past several weeks. Every eye in the room noticed them arrive. She felt it the way you feel whether not unpleasant, simply present. Lord Pemberton greeted them at the entrance with genuine warmth. The warmth of a man who was relieved that the situation had developed into something navigable rather than scandalous. Your Grace. He shook Richard's hand, then turned to Helen. You look wonderful. We're very glad you're here. We wouldn't have missed it, Helen said, and she meant both the social truth and the strategic one simultaneously. Lady Pemberton appeared at her elbow within minutes, pulling her into a conversation with the kind of deliberate social grace that was its own form of public statement. The Pembertons were positioning themselves clearly, and everyone in the room could read it. Across the room she could see Lady Ashworth watching with an expression that was equal parts satisfaction and anticipation. For the first hour, Helen worked the room with the ease of someone who had been doing this her entire adult life. She spoke to the Hargroves about their daughter's upcoming season. She discussed with Lord Carlisle a matter of estate law that he had been struggling with because she had read the relevant legislation in her father's library and could speak to it more precisely than his own solicitor. She spent 15 minutes with a woman she had met only twice before, the wife of a new member of Parliament from the West Riding, who was clearly feeling the particular social vertigo of a newcomer to this world, and whom Helen treated with the kind of direct, unpretentious warmth that made the woman's shoulders visibly drop by 2 inches. Richard, she noticed, stayed close. Not hovering, not performing attentiveness for the room's benefit, but genuinely close the way a man stays close to someone he is paying attention to rather than someone he is managing. Twice, she caught him watching her, not with the calculated assessment she knew so well from the years when she had been one of the factors in his social arithmetic, but with something that looked from a distance like rediscovery. She did not reward it, but she noticed it. The conversation she had been waiting for came after dinner, when the men had rejoined the women in the drawing room, and the social structure of the evening began to dissolve into smaller conversations. Lord Pemberton found her near the fireplace. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that what Richard said at the luncheon last week, it was heard, and believed." He paused. "Your position is exactly what it was. I wanted you to hear that from me directly." "Thank you." She looked at him steadily. "I never doubted my position." A slight smile crossed his face. "No, I don't suppose you did." The evening ended at 11. In the carriage home, Richard was quiet again for a few minutes. Then he turned to look at her. "You were extraordinary tonight." "I was myself tonight," Helen said. "I've always been that. You simply chose to look elsewhere." The words landed the way honest things land, not cruelly, but with the specific weight of something true. Richard absorbed it without deflecting. "Yes," he said, "I did." The second twist arrived 3 days later, and it came from a direction Helen had not anticipated. Lord Hargrove called on Richard at his club, and delivered in the blunt and unapologetic way that Lord Hargrove delivered all significant information. The news that a member of Richard's own business circle, a man named Caldwell, who had been involved in the northern coal ventures, had been making representations to several investors, suggesting that the instability in the Winthrop household was symptomatic of broader instability in the Winthrop financial position, and that certain investment partnerships might benefit from reconsideration. Richard came home that evening and told Helen immediately. This surprised her. She had been in her sitting room, going through Arthur's correspondence with his tutors. The boy was showing a remarkable aptitude for mathematics, which she had quietly been nurturing for 2 years, when Richard appeared in the doorway, with an expression she recognized as the particular look of a man who has received bad news, and is deciding in real time to be transparent about it rather than manage it alone. She listened to the full account. Then she said, "How much exposure does Caldwell actually have to the coal interests?" Richard blinked. "What? How much direct financial exposure does Caldwell have to the northern ventures? What's the nature of his investment stake, and when does it mature?" A pause. He came in at the second round of investment approximately 14 months ago. The stake matures in 18 months. So he's underwater at the current production rate. Helen set down Arthur's tutor report. "He's not undermining us because he's concerned about our marriage. He's undermining us because he's looking for leverage on the price of his exit." Richard stared at her for a moment. "You know the production figures." "I have always known the production figures." Her voice was patient rather than sharp. "Richard, I have managed this estate's financial interests for 4 years. Did you imagine I was doing that without understanding the numbers?" He sat down slowly in the chair near the door, the chair that Arthur usually claimed as his personal territory, as evidenced by the small wooden horse abandoned on its arm. "No," he said it quietly. "I didn't imagine that. I stopped asking you about it." "Yes." She picked up the tutor report again. "You did." Another silence. Then, "What do you recommend?" The question was so direct, so stripped of any ego or strategy, that Helen looked up from the report. I recommend we call Caldwell's position. We have the documentation to demonstrate the venture is performing within acceptable margins. He's speculating on our personal situation, making us negotiable, which tells us he has no actual financial leverage. She paused. I'll need to speak with Aldridge this week, and I want you to attend the meeting with Caldwell personally. You want me in the room. I want him to see us in the room together. Whatever story he has been telling, I want him to understand that this household is not in the state he has been representing. Richard looked at her with an expression she could not entirely categorize, something between admiration and something rawer, something that was grappling with what it meant to have spent years married to this woman and to have somehow managed not to fully see her. All right, he said. Whatever you need. The meeting with Caldwell happened in Mr. Aldridge's offices in York, which was neutral ground, and Helen's deliberate choice. Caldwell was a compact, careful man in his 50s who wore his prosperity visibly and his confidence in the specific way of men who had built their financial position from something smaller than where it now stood, with an edge of defensiveness beneath the surface ease. He came into Aldridge's office and stopped when he saw Helen seated at the table. He had expected Richard. He had not expected Helen. This was also deliberate. Mr. Caldwell. She extended her hand across the table with the exact degree of courtesy his position warranted, not more, not less. Thank you for coming. He recovered quickly, as men in his position learned to do. Your Grace, I wasn't aware you would be present. I manage the Winthrop financial interests, she said pleasantly. It seemed appropriate. Aldridge opened the folder. The documentation was thorough and unambiguous: production records, investment valuations, projected returns, through the maturity of Caldwell's stake. Helen had spent 2 evenings preparing the analysis because she believed that the most effective argument in a room like this one was not force of personality, but numbers that could not be disputed. Caldwell worked through the documentation with the attention of a man who had been hoping for a different picture. With each page she watched the specific deflation of someone whose strategy has been built on a premise that is turning out to be incorrect. At the end he looked up. These figures suggest the venture is performing adequately, he said. The venture is performing well within its projected parameters. Helen's voice was steady. The question is whether your concern about our household stability was based on these figures or on something else. A pause. How was a man who understood when he had been maneuvered into a corner and he was considering his options? There may have been some imprecision in certain conversations I've had, he said finally. I'm glad we could clarify it, Helen said. Imprecision has a way of becoming expensive. Caldwell left the meeting making no further representations to anyone. Aldridge had confirmed this by the end of the week through the particular information network that solicitors maintain, with the quiet professionalism of people who understand that their value lies partly in what they know. Richard, on the drive back from York, looked at his wife in the carriage with a directness he had rarely managed in the last several years. You planned every part of that meeting? Yes. The documentation, the location, being in the room, the timing? Yes. He was quiet for a moment. When did you know what Caldwell was actually doing? The evening you told me about it. She looked out the carriage window. It was the obvious interpretation. He was the one with something to gain from our vulnerability. The only question was how to remove the vulnerability before he could use it further. You did that in one meeting. We did that, she said. You were in the room. That mattered. The we was small, deliberate, and true, and she felt Richard receive it the way you receive something you have been waiting for, without quite knowing you were waiting. 3 weeks after her return to Winthrop Hall, Helen found the rosewood box. She had not hidden it. She had placed it in the drawer of the nightstand where she had put it that first night at Langford House, and then transferred it to the same drawer here without opening it, and it had been sitting there since, patient, as it had always been waiting. On a Tuesday evening when Arthur was asleep and the house was quiet, she opened the drawer and took it out. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it for a long time. Then she opened it. The watch was exactly as she had placed it. The ivory silk. The rosewood interior. The watchmaker's careful work. She turned it over. 7 years. Still yours. H. She thought about the woman who had chosen those words, who had stood at the watchmaker's counter and given him her handwriting and believed them completely. She was still that woman. This was the thing she had been learning and relearning in the weeks since the corridor, that what had happened had not unmade her. It had tested her. It had forced a clarity she had been avoiding. It had cost her something she was still accounting for. But it had not changed who she fundamentally was. She had been the woman who managed an estate from the edge of ruin. The woman who raised a child with intelligence and love. The woman who walked into her father's parlor without tears and told the truth about what had happened. The woman who called a meeting and removed Caldwell's leverage with documentation and careful preparation. The woman who looked at her husband across a library and demanded he say what he had done without decoration. She had been all of those things the whole time. She placed the watch back in the box. She did not know yet what she would do with it. Whether she would give it to Richard eventually, when she had more evidence of what he was becoming. Whether she would keep it as something else, not a gift, but a record of who she had been at the exact moment her life had changed. Whether there was some third option she hadn't identified. But she closed the box gently and returned it to the drawer and sat in the quiet of the bedroom she had not been sure she would ever sleep in again. Through the door she could hear Arthur making a small sound in his sleep, the unconscious commentary of a child processing the day and the nighttime sounds of Winthrop Hall settling around her, the timber and the wind and the distant creak of a house that was old and solid and had been standing through more than one difficult season. She was still standing too. That was for tonight enough. The first snow of December came early that year. Arthur announced it at breakfast with the authority of a 5-year-old who considers weather a personal event, climbing onto his chair and pressing both palms against the window glass and declaring that Admiral Wellington would require indoor accommodations immediately, as frogs did not serve well in cold campaigns. Helen moved the Admiral's habitat to the warm corner of the kitchen, negotiated with Mrs. Baxter over the terms of this arrangement, and returned to the breakfast table to find Richard watching her with the expression she had been cataloging privately for 6 weeks. The one that had no calculation in it, that arrived on his face when he thought she was not looking, and disappeared when he realized she was. She sat down and poured her tea and said nothing about it. The 6 weeks since her return had built something she did not yet have a name for. Not reconciliation, that word implied a return to what had existed before, and she had no interest in returning to what had existed before. Not forgiveness, exactly, forgiveness was real, but it was not the whole of what was happening. What it felt like from the inside was construction. Slow, deliberate, piece by piece, with full awareness of what each piece cost and what it was meant to hold. Richard had kept every condition. This was not a small thing. She had set the conditions knowing they were demanding. Knowing they required him to operate differently in rooms, she would never be present in knowing they required a form of accountability that had no audience and therefore no social reward. The easiest conditions to keep were the ones where people could see you keeping them. The hard ones were the private ones, the ones where the only person who would know was yourself. He had kept those too. She knew because she watched. Because Mrs. Baxter came to her voluntarily now with information rather than waiting to be asked. Because Aldridge's firm had produced the estate management documentation, and Richard had signed it without requesting a single modification. Because Lord Pemberton had told her father that Richard's behavior at the quarterly club gathering had been, in Pemberton's estimation, the behavior of a man who had made a decision and was living inside it consistently. And because Richard himself had changed in ways that were too small for performance and too consistent to be strategic. He asked about the estate, now, not the summary version, not the version that required her to filter it into digestible form for a man who had stopped caring about the details. He asked about specific tenants by name. He asked about the coal venture progress. He asked about Arthur's mathematics tutoring with the genuine curiosity of a man who had missed several years of his son's development and was trying to close the distance. He asked, and he listened, and he did not use what she told him to reposition himself or redirect the conversation toward his own priorities. She was watching for the moment he stopped. She had told herself honestly that she was watching for it, and that she would not pretend not to see it if it came. It had not come. The letter arrived on the second Wednesday of December, and it was addressed to Helen alone. Not through her husband, not through any intermediary. A personal letter delivered with the morning correspondence bearing a London postmark and a return address she did not recognize. She opened it at her desk. It was from a woman named Mrs. Edith Carow, who identified herself as Clara Beaumont's aunt, the woman who had raised Clara after her parents died when she was 11, who had scrimped and planned and worked to give her niece the musical education that had eventually produced the celebrated opera singer. Mrs. Carow wrote that she was not expecting anything from this letter. She wrote that she understood Helen had no reason to receive communication from anyone connected to the situation that had hurt her. She wrote that she wanted to say only one thing and would not presume to write again. She wrote, "My niece is 29 years old and was told by a man she trusted that his marriage was, in his own words, a matter of social obligation that bore no resemblance to genuine feeling." She believed him. I am not excusing what she did. She is old enough to have asked harder questions, and she knows that now. But I want you to know, because I believe you are the kind of woman who would want to know the truth, that she was lied to about the nature of what she was entering. The man who deceived you also deceived her. She has paid for it differently than you have, but she has paid. Helen read the letter 3 times. Then she sat for a long time at her desk without moving. She thought about Richard sitting across from her in the library, saying, "I brought a woman I was involved with into our home repeatedly, and I instructed our household staff to keep this from you." She had pushed him to say it without decoration because she needed to know he understood it fully. She had not in that moment been thinking about what he might have said to Clara Beaumont to make the arrangement seem acceptable. She had not been thinking about what lies it required to conduct an affair with a woman of Clara's background without her understanding the full reality of the situation. She put the letter in the drawer with the others. Then she went to find Richard. I was in the stables with Arthur, which had become a Saturday morning pattern over the past month. Richard, teaching Arthur to approach the horses with calm and confidence. The boy moving through the lesson with the absolute seriousness of someone who has decided this is important work. She stood at the stable door for a moment, watching them the way you watch something that is still becoming what it is going to be. Arthur saw her first. Papa says I can learn to ride properly in the spring." "Papa is correct." She looked at Richard over her son's head. "When you're finished here, I need to speak with you." He read her face the way he had been learning to read it again, not the version he had constructed in the years of distance, the version that was mostly his own assumptions about what she felt, but the actual version, the one that required him to pay attention. "Give me 10 minutes, he answered. She waited in the library. She had chosen the library deliberately because it was where the most honest conversation of the past 6 weeks had happened, where she had pushed him to say the thing without decoration, and he had said it, and she needed this conversation to be in a space that carried that history. He came in exactly 10 minutes later, still in his riding coat, and closed the door. She handed him Mrs. Carrow's letter without preamble. He read it standing. She watched his face move through it. She could see the exact moment he reached the part about what he had told Clara, what justification he had offered for the arrangement. The precise words Mrs. Carow had quoted back to him, a matter of social obligation that bore no resemblance to genuine feeling. He finished the letter. He did not look up immediately. He stood with the letter in his hand and looked at the floor for a moment, and Helen recognized the expression. It was the look of a man who has been believing at some level that his accounting of his own wrongdoing was reasonably complete, and who has just discovered that it was not. "You told her our marriage was nothing," Helen said. Not as an accusation, as a statement requiring acknowledgement. "Yes." His voice was very quiet. "I told her what made it easy to do what I wanted to do." "You lied to both of us." "Yes." "You lied to me by omission and evasion and 6 months of deliberate concealment. And you lied to her by telling her the marriage she was helping you betray didn't actually exist." Helen looked at him steadily. "Do you understand why that matters beyond what it meant for me?" He looked up from the floor. "Because it means I didn't just fail as a husband. I used another person as an instrument. I told her what she needed to hear so I could get what I wanted." "Yes." He set the letter on the table between them. I don't know how to address that, with her. I ended the connection, and I walked away, which was, I told myself, it was the clean resolution, but it was also the thing that was easiest for me. I'm not asking you to contact Clara Beaumont. Helen picked up the letter. I'm asking you to understand the full shape of what you did, because you cannot change something you haven't fully seen. He was quiet for a long moment. I see it, he said finally. I see it completely, and I don't. Helen, there is no version of this accounting in which I am not the person who caused most of the harm in every direction. She looked at him. It was the most complete statement of responsibility she had heard from him in 7 years of marriage, more complete than anything he had managed in the library 3 weeks ago. More complete than the luncheon corrections, more complete than any of the careful, deliberate behavior of the past weeks. Because it was not about what he was doing now, or what he intended. It was about what he had been. She returned the letter to her pocket. Then we continue from there, she said. Chake. Christmas came to Winthrop Hall, with Arthur's complete and wholehearted endorsement of every tradition simultaneously. He wanted the tree. He wanted the wassail. He wanted a specific number of candles that he had calculated based on some internal logic he declined to fully explain. He wanted Admiral Wellington to have a small celebration of his own, which Helen negotiated down to a particularly fine arrangement of greenery near the Admiral's habitat. He wanted his grandparents to come, which Edward and Margaret did, arriving 2 days before Christmas with the particular energy of grandparents who have decided this visit is important and have prepared accordingly. Margaret Langford walked through Winthrop Hall on the morning of her arrival with the careful attention of a woman who understands houses and what they tell you about the people inside them. She said nothing to Helen directly about what she was reading. But that evening, when the men were occupied with Arthur's extensive pre-Christmas agenda, and she and Helen were alone in the sitting room, she said, "It's different." Helen looked up from her needlework. The house. Margaret set down her own work. "It feels different from the last time I was here. Before all of this." "It is different." "Better." Helen considered this honestly. "More honest," she said. "Whether that translates to better depends on what happens next." Her mother nodded slowly. "That's a careful answer." "It's the accurate one." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "He looks at you differently." "I know." "Is it enough?" Helen set down her needlework. Outside the sitting room, she could hear Arthur explaining something to his grandfather with great urgency. Something that involved both Admiral Wellington and the logistics of Christmas morning, and Edward's measured, deeply entertained responses. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think it might become enough. I think what's happening right now has the structure of something that could be real." She paused. "But I've been wrong about his sincerity before. I'm not going to declare it settled until I've watched it long enough to trust it." "That's wise," Margaret said. "It's also hard." Helen's voice was quiet. "It would be so much simpler to either trust him completely or not trust him at all. The middle ground is, it's where all the difficult living actually happens." Her mother reached over and put her hand over Helen's. The same gesture she had made at the breakfast table the morning after that first night, the grip that did not offer solutions but simply acknowledged that something real was happening. "You were always the most honest person in any room you were in," Margaret said, "even when it cost you something." Helen did not answer, because the answer lived somewhere too deep for easy words, in the place where the exhaustion and the clarity and the stubborn refusal to be anything other than what she actually was had all compressed into something that was, she thought, perhaps the truest version of herself she had ever occupied. The twist came on Christmas Eve, and it came from the last direction Helen had anticipated. Edward Langford had been quieter than usual through the day. Not unhappily quiet, but the quiet of a man who is carrying something he is deciding when to say. Helen had noticed it at breakfast and again at lunch, and had let it sit because her father moved toward difficult conversations on his own schedule, and interrupting that schedule was never productive. After dinner, when Arthur had been put to bed with considerable ceremony and the adults had settled in the drawing room, Edward said, "I need to tell you both something." Both. He was looking at Helen and Richard together. Helen set down her coffee cup. "The coal ventures," Edward said, "have a more significant problem than Caldwell." Richard straightened almost imperceptibly. Helen went very still. "The surveying reports from 1882, her father continued. "The ones your father commissioned before he died. Richard I had them reviewed by an independent geologist this autumn. Quietly, because I wanted to be certain before I said anything." He paused. "The primary seam in the north shaft has a depth problem that was understated in the original reports. Not catastrophically, this is not a crisis that requires immediate response. But the productive lifespan of that seam is shorter than the investment structure assumes, and the current return projections for the next 12 years are based on figures that are going to need significant revision." The drawing room was very quiet. Helen was already thinking through the implications. The North Shaft was the primary asset in the Caldwell investment group, which they had just defended. It was also the basis of 3 other investor arrangements, and formed the most significant part of the Winthrop estate's non-agricultural income. "How significant is the revision?" Her voice was entirely steady. "The geologist believes productive capacity decreases by approximately 30% over a 7-year horizon, rather than the 15-year horizon in the original reports." Her father met her eyes. "It's manageable, Helen, but it requires a different strategy for the next several years, and it requires that strategy to begin soon." Richard was looking at the floor. She recognized the specific quality of this silence, the silence of a man confronting a problem that is large and has deep roots and must be dealt with regardless of what else is happening in his life. She looked at her father. "You've had this information since autumn." "Since October." He held her gaze. "I waited because I wanted to be certain, and because I felt that the other matters required stabilization before this one was added to the weight. You made a judgment about what I could carry. I made a judgment about what was strategically sound, which is different." He said it with the directness of a man who loves his daughter and respects her enough not to pretend the distinction away. "I may have been wrong about the timing. I don't think I was wrong about waiting for the certainty." Helen absorbed this. Then she turned to Richard. I was looking at her now, not at the floor. His expression had moved through the initial impact and settled into something that was, she recognized, waiting on her, waiting to understand how she was reading the situation before he formed his own response, which was a behavior she had not seen from him in a very long time, and which told her something important. "We need Aldridge in the first week of January," she said. "The full investment picture, the revised geological data, and every contract that references the North Shaft projections." She paused. "And we need to have a specific conversation about the agricultural holding in the East Riding, because I've been watching the productivity figures there for 2 years, and I think there's a restructuring opportunity that hasn't been fully explored." Richard looked at her for a moment. "You've been planning for this?" "I've been watching the indicators," she said. "I didn't know about the geological report, but I knew the North Shaft numbers felt optimistic." She turned back to her father. "Thank you for telling us. Both of us," she added, and the both was deliberate, and her father heard it. On Christmas morning, Arthur came downstairs at an hour that could only be described as aggressive, and the day reorganized itself entirely around him, around the specific miracle of a 5-year-old, for whom everything in the world is still possible, and Christmas is evidence of this, whose delight is so complete and so genuine that it pulls the adults around him into something they had not expected to feel. Edward played chess with Arthur after breakfast, and lost twice, which Arthur accepted with the magnanimity of a child who has not yet learned to conceal satisfaction. Margaret produced from somewhere in her luggage a set of illustrated books about natural history that Arthur received with the reverence of someone being handed a significant artifact. Richard built a small wooden enclosure for Admiral Wellington, with Arthur directing every detail, and the result was structurally questionable, but Arthur declared it magnificent, which settled the matter. Helen watched all of it. She sat in the drawing room that afternoon with the sounds of her family around her, her parents, her son, her husband, and felt something she could not immediately name, something that lived in the space between grief and gratitude, between what had been lost and what was being built in its place. It was not happiness exactly in the simple sense. Too much had happened for simple happiness to be quite the right shape for what she felt. It was more like honesty. The feeling of being in a room that was real with people who were real in a situation that was genuinely what it appeared to be, rather than a performance of something it was not. She had not had that feeling inside Winthrop Hall for a long time. Richard found her there in the quiet of the late afternoon when Arthur had fallen asleep between his grandparents on the settee, the particular sleep of a child who has spent everything and the house was still. He sat beside her, not close enough to require a response, simply present. After a while he said quietly, "I want to tell you something." She waited. "The night I said those words in the drawing room, I didn't know you were there." He kept his voice low, careful not to disturb the sleepers across the room. "I'm not saying that as mitigation. What I said was what I believed, which is its own kind of damning. But I want you to know that there was never a point when I believed you deserved to hear it." Helen looked at her sleeping son. "What you believed," she said slowly, "was that I was background, that the house ran, and Arthur was tended, and your name was protected, and those things simply happened like weather without cost or intelligence or effort." She paused. "You believed I was the furniture of your life, rather than a person living in it." "Yes." His voice was stripped of everything but the truth. "That's exactly what I believed. And I was wrong in a way that I'm still understanding the full depth of." She turned to look at him. He looked tired. She thought not. Defeated, but the tired of a man who has been doing honest work for 6 weeks and knows there are many more weeks of it ahead and has chosen to do it anyway. "Why did you stop seeing me?" she asked. Not with accusation, genuinely wanting to know. He was quiet for a long time. "Because you were so capable," he said finally. "Everything you touched worked. The estate, the staff, Arthur, social situations. You never needed me to solve anything. And somewhere in that I told myself it meant you didn't need me at all, that I was incidental to the life you were running." A pause. "So I found someone who seemed to need what I offered, and I told myself it wasn't what it was." Helen looked at him. "Richard." Her voice was patient and direct. "Competence is not the absence of need. I was capable because I had to be, because someone had to be, because the estate needed managing and our son needed raising, and I was the person who was there." She paused. "I needed you to see me. That's what I needed. I needed to be something other than the mechanism that kept your life functioning." He absorbed this. "I know that now." "You're going to have to keep knowing it," she said. "Not just today. I know that too." In the second week of January, something happened that Helen had not planned for and could not have anticipated. Mr. Aldridge arrived at Winthrop Hall for the scheduled meeting about the coal venture restructuring, and he brought with him a document that had arrived at his office the previous week, a document that turned out to be relevant to everything, though it had originated entirely outside their situation. It was a geological survey commissioned independently by a consortium of northern investors of the entire Yorkshire coal region. And within it, buried in the technical appendix, was a section on the Winthrop North Shaft that contained not just confirmation of the depth problem Edwards' geologist had identified, but something additional evidence that the original 1882 survey, the one commissioned by Richard's father, had been conducted by a firm with a financial interest in presenting optimistic projections because they held a secondary investment position that matured on a timeline dependent on continued extraction estimates. The original survey had not been inaccurate through incompetence. It had been dishonest by design. The full implication of this was significant. The investors who had entered the Winthrop coal ventures on the basis of those projections, including Caldwell, had a legitimate claim that they had been misled. Not by Richard or Helen, but by the original documentation the elder Duke Winthrop had commissioned and presented as accurate. Helen sat with this information for a long time after Aldridge finished explaining it. Then she looked at Richard across the table. "Your father knew." "I don't know." Richard's jaw was tight. "I don't know what he knew. He's been dead for 9 years and I can't ask him. But I can tell you that this changes the character of our obligation to the investors materially. Aldridge looked between them carefully. The legal exposure is limited, given the time elapsed and the fact that neither of you commissioned the original survey. But the moral and reputational exposure. We're going to disclose it, Helen said. Both men looked at her. We are going to go to the investors, including Caldwell, with the full picture. What the new geological data shows, and what the original survey concealed, and how we intend to restructure the arrangements to reflect reality. She looked at Aldridge. All of them, before they find out from the consortium report. Aldridge nodded slowly. That is a considerable act of good faith. It's the right thing to do. She looked at Richard. It's also strategically sound. The consortium report is going to surface the discrepancy regardless. The only question is whether the Winthrop name is associated with concealment or with honesty when it does. Richard looked at his wife for a moment. Then he said to Aldridge, "Do as she says. Whatever she determines is the right approach is what we do." Aldridge gathered his papers. Helen looked at the man across the table from her. This man who had once told a room that his marriage was a matter of social obligation, bearing no resemblance to genuine feeling, who had given instructions to her household staff behind her back, who had spoken words in an open doorway that had cracked 7 years in two and understood something she had not been ready to understand until this moment. He had changed because he had been required to. And then he had kept changing because he had decided to. Those were different things, and both of them were true. She was not finished watching. She would not stop watching. But she was beginning with clear eyes and full information to believe that what she was watching was real. In March, when the ground was beginning to soften, and Arthur had declared the spring offensive season officially open in the garden, Helen went to the nightstand drawer and took out the rosewood box. She carried it downstairs to the library, where Richard was reviewing the restructured coal venture documentation, a process that had taken 2 months and multiple meetings and considerable discomfort, and had produced in the end a set of agreements with every investor that was honest and sustainable, and had preserved the Winthrop name through the only means by which it deserved to be preserved. She set the box on the desk in front of him. He looked at it. He recognized it. She could see the recognition move across his face, the slight intake of breath of a man who understands that something significant is being offered. "This was your anniversary gift," he said. It was. She sat down across from him. "Open it." He opened the box carefully, the way you open something fragile that matters. He took the watch out. He turned it over. He read the engraving. 7 years. Still yours. H. He looked up at her. His eyes were not entirely steady. "I had it made 8 months ago," she said. "The night I came home and heard you through that door I was carrying this. I had planned to give it to you." He said nothing. He was holding the watch in both hands, and he was not performing anything. Not gratitude, not relief, not the carefully managed emotion of a man who knows he is being watched. He simply was. "I'm giving it to you now," Helen said, "because the engraving is still true. Not in the way it was when I had it made. I can't go back to who I was that night, and I wouldn't if I could. But it's true in a different way." She paused. "I am still yours, Richard. I am yours in the way that two people who have been through something real, and survived it, and chosen each other on the other side, are each other's. That's a harder and more honest version of the same thing." He looked at the watch. He looked at her. "I don't deserve this," he said quietly. "No," she agreed. "You don't yet, but you're becoming someone who might." She held his gaze. "Don't stop." He closed his hand around the watch. Outside the library window, she could hear Arthur in the garden conducting what sounded like a formal inspection of the rose beds in preparation for the spring campaign, issuing commands to a small army that existed entirely in his imagination, and responded apparently with great enthusiasm. Helen looked at her husband, this complicated, flawed, trying man, who had broken something important and was working piece by piece to understand how to be worthy of it. And she felt the weight of everything that had led to this room and this moment and this specific quality of hard-won honesty between them. She was not naive about what remained. There would be difficult days. There would be moments when the memory of the corridor and the open door and those words came back with full force, and she would have to decide again, with full information and full awareness, to stay inside what they were building. She had been wrong about him once. She would remain clear-eyed. But she had also been right about him once. Right about the man who had asked the right question in the library at the Ashworth's party, who had held her hands through the long night of their son's birth, who had embraced her when she brought his estate back from ruin. That man had not been a fiction. He had simply been buried under years of unchallenged assumptions and untested comfort, and the specific moral laziness of someone who had never been required to account for himself. How was being required to account for himself now? And he was doing it. Helen Winthrop, who had managed a household and an estate and a marriage and a crisis and her own dignity with the same clear intelligence she had brought to every challenge of her adult life, looked at her husband and understood something that no one had told her, but that she had earned the right to know. A marriage did not survive because neither person ever failed. A marriage survived because both people, when they failed, were willing to see it clearly and do the harder work of beginning again. This was their beginning. Not the beginning of something new. The beginning of something truer than what had come before. Something that had been tested in the hardest possible way and had not broken because the woman at the center of it had refused to break, had refused to become smaller or quieter or less than what she was, had held her ground and set her terms, and watched with clear eyes and loved with a love that did not require her to disappear inside it. She stood up. She moved toward the door. Then she turned back once, the way you turn back to confirm something you already know. Richard was still holding the watch. He was looking at it with the expression of a man who understands for the first time completely what he had almost lost. Helen Winthrop walked out into the sound of her son's voice in the garden, into the bright cold air of a March morning, into the life she had rebuilt on her own terms, and she did not look back again. She did not need to. She knew exactly